Hello and welcome. Today we're diving into a really fascinating legal puzzle that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And get this, it all started because of a single missing number. It's a story about a mother's final wish, a tiny legal technicality, and a decision that tells us so much about the spirit of justice itself. And right at the very heart of this whole legal drama is this simple, really powerful plea from a mother, Bibiana Roxas de Jesus, written in her own hand. You know, she knew it wasn't some fancy legal document, but she wanted her will, what she called her win, to be respected. This note just perfectly sets the personal stakes for everything that's about to unfold.
So here's our game plan for today. We're going to start with how the will was discovered in the first place. Then we'll zoom in on the one tiny detail that caused all the trouble, the date. After that, we'll explore the two clashing legal arguments, see exactly how the Supreme Court thought its way through the problem, and finally, we'll get to the verdict and its lasting impact.
All right, let's get right into the facts of the case. Our story really kicks off back in 1973, right after Bibiana Roxas de Jesus and her husband had passed away. As the family began the difficult process of settling their affairs, something completely unexpected turned up.
So here's how it all went down. Bibiana's brother, Simeon, was put in charge of managing the estate, and while he was going through her things, he found something incredible. Tucked inside one of her notebooks was what looked like her last will and testament. He did the right thing, brought it to the court, and a hearing was scheduled to see if this thing was legit. Now let's take a closer look at this document. It was really a personal letter written to her kids. It was found spread across a few pages in a notebook, and it was entirely in her own handwriting, signed by her. Her children even confirmed, yep, that's Mom's handwriting, that's her signature, she definitely wrote this. Everything seemed to be in perfect order, except for that one little detail on the very last line, the date. And this, right here, brings us to the absolute core of the entire case. This simple, abbreviated date would end up sparking a massive legal fight that went all the way to the highest court in the land. This is it. The whole problem boils down to these 6 characters. FEB/61, February 1961. We have a month, we have a year, but where's the day? And you know, in the very precise world of legal formalities, that missing day turned out to be a huge, huge deal. And that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Does Feb 61 actually count as a valid date under the law? The fate of this entire will and Bibiana's last wishes all hangs on the answer to this one question.
Okay, so the law we're talking about here is Article 810 of the Civil Code. It covers what's called a holographic will. That's just a fancy term for a will that's completely handwritten. And the law is crystal clear on the 3 big requirements. It has to be entirely written, it has to be signed, and it has to be dated by the person making it. Nobody was arguing about the handwriting or the signature. It all came down to what that one little word, dated, really means.
Now, the journey through the lower court was a total roller coaster. At first, the judge said, yep, this looks good, and he allowed the will. But then one of the heirs objected. She argued that Feb 61 wasn't a real date according to the law. And, well, the judge was persuaded. He changed his mind, reversed his own decision, and disallowed the will. And that reversal is what sent the case straight to the Supreme Court. So now we're at the Supreme Court, and we've got 2 completely different ways of looking at the law on a collision course. It's a classic showdown, a strict, by-the-book interpretation versus a more flexible one that focuses on what the person actually intended. Let's break down the 2 sides. The family members who wanted the will to be honored, the liberal view, argued, hey, the law just says dated. It doesn't say complete date. They pointed out that the old law used to specify year, month, and date, but the new law dropped that. They said this was a deliberate change to honor the person's wishes. On the other side, the strict view argued that you have to follow the rules for wills to the absolute letter to prevent fraud. They even brought up U.S. cases where incomplete dates made wills invalid. So with these 2 strong arguments, how in the world did the Supreme Court make a decision? Well, this is where it gets really smart. They didn't just stare at the word dated. They asked a much bigger question. What's the reason for the rule in the first place? This is what lawyers call the ratio decidendi, the core logic behind the decision.
The court actually looked back to a fundamental principle from an older case. It basically says that the whole point of all these rules, the signatures, the handwriting, the date, is to slam the door on fraud and bad faith. These formalities aren't there just for show. They have a very specific protective purpose.
And this really lays out the court's thought process beautifully. First, they asked, why do we need a date? Answer, to stop fraud and know when it was written. Second, they looked at the facts of this case. Is there any sign of fraud here? Any bad faith? The answer was no. Even the person objecting agreed it was her mother's handwriting. Third, is the will's authenticity in doubt at all? Again, no. So the court's conclusion was simple. Since the purpose of the law was met and the will was clearly genuine, the objection about the missing day was just being too technical. The court also pointed out that this wasn't happening in a vacuum. There's been a general trend in the law to be more liberal about wills, to give people more freedom to decide what happens to their property. The idea is that the law would much rather uphold a person's will than have them die intestate, where the law just divides things up by a rigid formula. The goal is to make the person's intent a reality whenever possible. So, with all of this reasoning, looking at the facts, the purpose of the law, the bigger legal trends, it all leads us to the final outcome. The Supreme Court was ready to make its call. And the decision was unmistakable. The petition is granted. In other words, Bibiana Roxas de Jesus's will was officially declared valid. So what does that mean in plain English? The Supreme Court basically hit the undo button on the lower court's second decision, the one that rejected the will. And they brought back the judge's very first decision, the one that had approved it. The bottom line, Bibiana's final wishes were finally going to be respected. And the big takeaway from this case, its lasting legacy, is the strengthening of a legal idea called substantial compliance. It's a powerful doctrine. It says that as long as you've basically followed the spirit of the law, and there's no chance of fraud or anything shady, a small technical error shouldn't be enough to throw out a person's will. It's a victory for substance over pure, rigid form. And that really leaves us with something to think about, doesn't it? This case from decades ago shows that the law, at its best, can be flexible and look past the tiny details to find the real human intent. It's a great reminder that while rules are important, their ultimate goal should be to find a just and fair result. It really makes you wonder, where else in our lives do we see this tension between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law playing out today?